Welcome to Stories from the Top. I'm your host, Lance Tanaka, and I'll be interviewing successful executives from the best of the best global companies about leadership and their journey. Today I'm excited to be able to sit down with David Feld. A friend of mine introduced me to him. He says, hey, you got to meet David. This guy is the guru of financial services, and he's a great guy. And he was absolutely right. So let me give you a quick background of who David is. He was with Standard Bank for 20 years, head of the firm's capital markets and principal trading teams. He was an executive committee member and a board director. Then he was the co-founder and chief investment officer of Cosford Capital Management. And then most recently, he is the founding partner of Auden Reed Advisory. But also another interesting thing, and we have to ask him about it, he was a swimmer in the United States Olympic trials. So David, thank you for taking the time to sit down with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Lance. Thank you for asking me.
Sure thing. Anything that you can add to that introduction that I gave to you?
You've captured me quite well, eerily well. How did you do that?
I don't know. It must be a gift. Okay.
No, I don't have any. I don't have anything to add other than the word guru is a little bit strong, in my opinion.
No, not to the people I've talked to, so I think it's appropriately titled. So let's start with sharing your journey. I mean, you were a finance guru, maybe not according to yourself, but you were a financial guru. And what was that journey to go from there to where you are today?
Well, I started as a banker lending money to Mexico in 1979. And without going into all the ups and downs, I eventually became a markets person, investing in emerging markets like Mexico, Russia, Philippines, Nigeria, you name it. And it turned out that I had a decent talent and mentality for doing that. And part of the reason for my success was my ego was generally in control. One of the secrets in investing is to not totally believe your own BS. And one of the challenges that you'll read from many investors is how do you develop a deep conviction in an investment? The hard part is when it starts to go wrong. How do you determine whether your analysis of that deep conviction will ultimately be correct, or whether your ego is getting in the way and it's time to take a loss on the investment and try something else? And that was probably one of my better strengths. I certainly was not the intellectual giant on my team. I ended up assembling over the years a team of very disparate people. We had true diversity of cognitive approach. Key diversity was the way of thinking. Conducted those such that one person plus one person equals at least 2.01. And I would say many times on my team, we got to 1 + 1 = 3. So I loved the journey. In any event, I did this for 36 years. And what caused the change in my life was that I went from Standard Bank, where I enjoyed 20 wonderful years, to create my own investment management firm. And I shouldn't say my own, it was with my team again. We were definitely together stronger than the sum of the parts. We were unsuccessful raising sufficient money to justify continuing on losing money with our own money that we'd invested in the firm. That's a whole nother long story as to why we were not successful. I would say ultimately the market was right not to give us sufficient money to justify launching. I then interviewed for a year with investment management firms in London. The last one with a Swiss investment management company, and forgive the boast, Lance, so not guru, but I was easily the best qualified for the job. They started with 20 candidates. They got down to 2, and they decided to go with a much younger candidate. And they said to me openly through the headhunter, David, you're too old. And although that really hurt my feelings at the time, I was then in a cycling crash 2 months later in the French Alps, where I broke my pelvis and my ribs and my pride. It was a pretty bad episode. I was in hospital for 19 days, major surgery to put my pelvis back together. Didn't walk properly for a couple of months. And for the first time in my life, I had the willingness and the time to contemplate. And what I thought was, one, do I want to go back to the investment fight? Two, can I go back? This is a pretty severe message from the Swiss investment management company. And then in one of those serendipitous breaks that we all hope we get every now and then in life, one of my oldest friends in the world came to visit Anne and me. Kate came on a visit and came down to our place for dinner. And I was describing to her, by this stage, when I was walking again, I was looking for part-time advisory jobs in investment management, because I thought, why not share my experiences with people? They might be interested in some of the things I've lived through over these 36 years. And when I described that to her, she said, that sounds like coaching to me. You need to talk to Greg. Now, her husband, Greg, I've known almost as long, almost 40 years. He had been the chief counsel of Delta Airlines. Greg is 7 years older than I am. So he retired in 2006. He went back to Emory University to be a dean of students at the law school, and then he'd become a coach. And so I called Greg, and it was one of the few light bulb moments of my life. I got off the phone thinking I'd been on it about 30 minutes, and you know, you can look at your phone these days and see how long you've been yapping. It was 90 minutes. And then and there, I decided I'd like to become a coach based on what Greg had told me about what he was up to. So at that stage, I started talking to my friends. I'd never been coached, never been touched by it. So I couldn't even have told you what coaching was. And then I started, until Greg had explained it to me. So I started talking to some of my friends who had been coached, and I met some of their coaches. And one of them I was introduced to as one of the longest standing coaches in the UK, who's been going about 30 years. And I met her in London and described to her some of the reading I'd done that Greg had recommended, one of which was The Inner Game of Tennis, which some would argue is sort of the foundational text of coaching. And she said, yes, you seem appropriate. Your attitude seems appropriate to become a coach, but you need to be trained. I said, well, of course, I understand that. Where do you suggest I go for my training? And she had recommended that I read Coaching for Performance by Sir John Whitmore, who, as most coaches know, is a co-creator of the GROW model. And so this coach had recommended I read the book, and I absolutely loved it. It really spoke to me. And so I went back to the coach and said, well, you recommended I read this book by Sir John. Well, what about his company to be trained? And she said, it's kind of sporty. And that was the weirdest comment. I didn't even ask her to explain it to me. I thought, I'm going to check this out myself. So I did my training there. And it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Obviously, there's a self-selection process going on there. Everybody that was there for training is interested in people, and in particular, wanting to become a coach. But the diversity was astounding between nationality, gender, professional background to that point in time. And then I had one other lucky break, which was while I was still looking, two other breaks. The two firms that I mentioned earlier, where I was negotiating to be a part-time advisor to the investment management companies, by this stage, having decided to become a coach, I went back to them to have a conversation as to which would be of more value to them, me as a coach on a temporary basis to some of their people, or as a part-time advisor telling war stories. And we came to the mutual conclusion that the coaching would be more valuable. So I started my training knowing I had these guys willing to work with me, because although I was going to be a very young and experienced coach, I was steeped in the business and the culture in which they were involved. And then I went to see an old cycling friend who, to use a sporting analogy, I know you like tennis, Lance. So this guy was the Roger Federer of interest rate derivative trading in Europe. And I went to see him because by this stage he'd shifted. When he was the Roger Federer of interest rate derivative trading, he was with one of the world's top 5 banks. And he had shifted to run the London office of one of the world's bigger hedge funds, New York headquarters. He was no longer, so I went to see him again on this search for investment advisory positions, and there was nothing available at that point. And I said to him almost in passing at the end of lunch that I was planning to become a coach. And he leaned forward across the table and he said, I'll work with you.
An LT observation. In interviews, we hear over and over the importance of network.
And so I started the training with a client in hand. And so then he was my first assignment. And although trading was the motivation for his working with me, we actually ended up spending as much time talking about work-life balance as trading, because that's actually what was the issue. How do sports influence my coaching? I was a swimmer growing up. I swam all the way through university. I was lucky enough to have a full ride at the University of New Mexico, which, in spite of being desert-based, was one of the top 10 swimming teams in the NCAA during my era. I swam in the U.S. Olympic trials in 1972. I did not, so as a 17-year-old, so as a 21-year-old, I finished 10th in the ninth in the United States when I was 18, 10th in the United States when I was 20, and when I was 21, I don't even know what I finished because I had a really bad year. And it was an early lesson for me in the fact that if you narrow focus too much, it can be a bad thing, because I took only 3 classes that year. I was totally focused on making the Olympic trials and maybe the big dream of the Olympics. And it was the wrong move. I did poorly. And it's a lesson I've never really forgotten. And when I think about it a lot with people, that if the focus is too narrow, it can be to the detriment of other things. Of course, it depends on what a person's trying to achieve, but it certainly has influenced me ever since. The lessons from sports that I carry out to this day, both in my professional business career and now as a coach, are all about the power of the team. Swimming is a brutal sport. We were up every morning at 5 a.m. We would swim 4 to 6 hours a day, depending on the time of year. And of course, your face is buried in the pool the whole time. It's about being with people that are like-minded, whose company you enjoy, who have a common purpose, a common motivation to excel, and a joy at the pain and the agony of carrying out swimming, or whatever it doesn't really matter, whatever the sport is that one enjoys. And that's carried through to the way I led teams as a business person and now as a coach. Getting back to what I said earlier, 1 + 1, if we're going to be successful, needs to be more than 2. And as all of us have experienced in our professional careers, sometimes that 1 + 1 is 1.5, and sometimes it's negative.
An LT observation. David is in an industry full of individual stars, but his success is due to the power of team. 1 + 1 is greater than 2.
And this is a huge motivation for me as a coach, to help people get to at least over 2. Sometimes they're in the negative position when we first start the coaching. That could be because of their perfectionism. It could be because of the way they conduct themselves with other people, even if they're not perfectionists. But whatever it is, helping them be more productive in their interactions with other human beings comes directly from my sporting background, where many times there were people with tremendous talents, but they couldn't conquer the mental side of things. It's not just the talent, it's also the attitude. And we've all seen this in life. The people with the right attitude and perhaps somewhat modest innate talent, shall we say, can go a long, long ways. And certainly some of the greatest leaders in history are, the old joke is those who can't do, teach. But there's some truth to this, that certainly Roger Federer doesn't have a coach who's as good as he is, or who was as good as he is. But that coach is helping Federer see himself and to constantly hone his skills. And so this is one of the lessons from sports, because certainly my swimming coach, one of them was a great coach. He was on a great swimmer. He was on the world championship team in 1973. One of my other coaches was a decent swimmer, but not a spectacular swimmer. But his ability to get people to think about how to have the right attitude, to excel, and what to do to achieve that excellence was absolutely supreme. He's one of my best friends to this day. He's now 78 years old, still going strong, still running, still swimming.
Oh, David, you mentioned this 1 plus 1 greater than 2. I mean, you mentioned it in a couple situations. So you said it's a huge motivation. When you look back at the finance experience, as I work with a lot of financial gurus, they tend to be fairly individual. It's more like an individual sport. How did that contribute to your success in the finance side?
Well, I'll describe one of my teammates. We worked together for 20 years, and we used to make the joke that when he looked at stuff perpendicularly, he just had this curious talent for seeing things that others didn't. But at the same, so that was a huge strength. But at the same time, he could on occasion have an outrageous risk appetite for something, and other occasions, very little risk appetite at all. And part of my job was one to recognize when he had a great idea. I was not an original thinker, and I'm not to this day, but I had a decent strength at recognizing really good ideas. And half the time I'd be saying, this idea is tremendous. We are going to invest millions, even if he was reticent about it. And other times I was literally putting a straitjacket on him. No, 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 this does not make sense. And I think I'm sure you've run into this a lot in your own coaching, Lance. So in effect, he was very imaginative, if we can put it in Hogan terms. And part of the issue for anyone that's imaginative is they have a lot of ideas, and it's difficult for them to be practical about which idea would be the most practical. They fall in love with all their ideas. So I was in the role of being the practical guy to say, this idea we really go for, and this idea we don't. So by definition, those were two people together rather than that individual. And together we were so much more effective than I would have been on my own, or he would have been on his own. And that was reflected across the team. I mean, I had people in New York, Miami, Singapore, Hong Kong, and London. And together we had some tremendous successes. And also one of our strengths was together we would question each other, so that when those crazy market incidents occurred, we were not, as a group, collectively just putting our heads under the table, or our heads in the sand, as they say, and saying, we just don't understand what's going on. We can't sell at this level. We'll just wait until the storm passes. Because that's really how you lose your investors all of their money, and you lose your career as well. On the contrary, we were debating with each other all the time. So again, the 1 plus 1 was always equaling greater than 2. Arguably, the proof of that is I was in the industry for 36 years.
An LT observation. A good team has members with complementary strengths. It takes a confident leader who surrounds themselves with people who possess strengths where the leader is weak. And so you're talking about leveraging your strengths, and the diversity of the team was you're pulling upon everybody's strengths to come up to a greater than 2. 1 plus 1 greater than 2. Is this something that you've always had? You've always believed in this, or was there something that evolved to get you to that thinking?
Yeah, it really has. You're getting me a little bit nostalgic thinking about my team, because my investment team. Because, I mean, to give you another example, I had a wonderful young Spaniard. He joined my team when he was 29. He'd been an analyst at another bank where he worked for a former colleague of mine who hugely rated him. And she called me up one day, and he was on the continent at that point. And she said, look, I've got this wonderful young guy. He wants to move to London with his wife. Would you meet him? And at the time, I wasn't thinking of hiring anyone else. So I met him. I thought, God, this guy's really good. I should show him around the bank. And the more I introduced him to other people in the bank, the more I was thinking, why am I not hiring him? And so I'm telling you this story because he started as an analyst, and then he became a portfolio manager. So he's taking risk in his own right, along the lines that I've described, in the team context. But eventually, he and I talked about what gives him the deepest satisfaction. And what really gave him satisfaction was finding those investment ideas and analyzing the hell out of them, but not investing in them. He did not like running the money himself. it just didn't suit his personality. In other words, if it was his responsibility, his stomach was going crazy. And so that's when he and I became, in effect, investment partners. I said, that is absolutely fine. You find those ideas, research the hell out of them. I'll use my years of making mistakes to decide how we size those up and whether we really pursue them or not. And so together, again, this was a 1+1 that ended up being about 5. I mean, we had some tremendous successes together because we figured out what were his strengths and what didn't give him joy. It was absolute. I hadn't thought about this in a long time. Thank you for prompting the memory. And it was absolutely powerful.
Absolutely. You combine your strengths and your passions and you put that into your everyday life or career, amazing things can happen.
Yeah.
Okay, so what advice would you give to your younger self?
The biggest advice I would give is to look further down the road. If I have any wistfulness about my career, it's that I literally never looked up until I was in that cycle. I should say, I didn't look down the road until I was lying in the hospital from the cycling crash. I never thought about future scenarios. I never conducted myself the way I do with my clients with the GROW model, which is to ask them to just dream. Look down the road 10, 15, 20 years. Not to find the answer, but to find some scenarios. What is something that if we really dreamed heavily might be a thing to strive for, or 3 things to strive for. I never, ever did that, Lance. And that's my biggest blissfulness, I think. Whether my life would have turned out any differently, I don't know. But I was literally drilled into the markets pretty much from my late 30s until I woke up in the ambulance.
An LT observation. Great advice. Look down the road. Identify your path and dream. Yeah, what are the principles or areas that we use in our coaching is this whole concept around true north versus north. And you talked about don't define the answer, which is I would look at true north, that one point in the distance. And then you said look at scenarios, which I would look at north.
Yeah. No, that's a better way to describe it. Absolutely. I mean, of course, as you've heard from my story, I've ended up with this very late career shift into something. If I have any other regret, it's that I didn't become a coach a lot earlier. Because although I love the Rubrik's Cube of investing, it doesn't come close to the satisfaction of helping a person find their answers.
Yeah, you said that, like you said this a few times throughout our sit down about making mistakes and failure. Can you kind of comment about that? What did that teach you, or what did you learn, or because a lot of people are afraid to do things or to take risks, or as you said, look further down the road because they're afraid of failure.
I mean, one of the things about investing, and that's where one of my colleagues I described earlier was so interesting, was people either become paralyzed by fear that they're going to be wrong, so they don't make the investment, or they have very little fear of it at all, so they overdo it. For whatever reason, I'm not really sure why I was reasonably balanced in that regard. Not always. I mean, I could tell you a number of really serious horror stories, but I never went over the line. And so certainly when I think about some of the experiences I've had with failure as a business person, it does inform some of the ways that I work with my clients. Partly because a number of the clients have been perfectionists. And this is a really pernicious trait in so many ways. But one of them is also that it often lies with a fear of failure, and therefore the attention to detail and minutia that the client has been applying. The irony, of course, is in their early part of their career, it's often been an enhancement to their promotions because they're so damn detail oriented and they work hard. But as they move up the ladder, that fear of failure and that perfectionism means that they are working outrageous hours and they're not developing their people. They're telling their people what to do, or they're doing it themselves because it's just faster to do it myself, David, than to try and teach so-and-so how to do it. And so a lot of the work then in the coaching assignment is about helping them see how much more productive they could be if they redirect their perfectionism to a minority of what they do. And of course, this is one of your great techniques, Lance, the 80-20. Give the client permission to be a perfectionist on 20% of various things, but not on the other 80. And that has helped a number of my clients deal with the fear of failure and deal with the way they dealt with that fear of failure by being so obsessed with the perfection and the minutiae.
An LT observation. There's nothing wrong with being a perfectionist unless it's on autopilot and you're doing it all the time. We coach perfectionists to pick their battles. You can be perfect on the 20% most important things, but you need to let go on the 80%. So what do you admire in leaders?
I admire people who can, and it's an unusual trait, and I didn't have it particularly myself, but who hone their competitiveness to achieve. They sublimate it to the company, the clients, and the team before themselves. And I was very fortunate to have one leader in particular like that. And I didn't think in these terms when I worked for him. I mean, I worked for him from 1992 to 2002. But when I look back on him now, he really wanted to succeed, but he wanted us to succeed. He wanted the team to succeed. It wasn't about him. And if we succeeded, then he would succeed. And also, and again, I repeat, and I had no idea what coaching was until I had that conversation with my friend Greg. But I look back on this leader, he always asked questions. I cannot remember him once ever telling me what to do. And every now and then I'd lose millions of dollars, which you know, by definition, you're going to do as an investor. And he would just ask me a series of questions. What was I thinking here? How was I feeling? What were my thoughts about next steps? He was gauging, was I thinking clearly? Were my emotions getting in the way? But he wasn't telling me what to do. But by the way he would ask the questions, I would look at myself. Now I look back now, I could see that. He was not trained as a coach, Lance. And he was a corporate finance guy by background, not a markets guy. But he was a really good leader. And I guess he'd become the leader of the bank because his qualities as a leader, even in corporate finance, have become apparent to the bank. The other thing I admire is leaders that leverage people, that enable their people. So as many of us know who love to read business literature, the history is littered with genius leaders who really were geniuses, but they were surrounded by acolytes who carried out their genius ideas. And the ideas were great and they carried them out well. But the second that leader was gone, the company is over. So for me, the leaders that enable their people are not only getting that leverage effect, they're also building the next generation. So it will be beyond them. And that's kind of the ultimate proof, in my view, of whether a leader is great or not. Did they develop the next generation?
One last question. Give me 3 words to best describe yourself.
Curious, empathetic, endurance athlete. 4 words.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, how can people reach you? How can people contact you if they'd like to reach out to you?
Well, my email address is david.feld@audenreid, AUDENREID.com, and also David Feld on LinkedIn.
David, excellent. It was really great to sit down with you. Great thoughts, and I'm sure this is going to be very valuable for people to listen to. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Lance. I really appreciate the opportunity.
To hear more of our 2 podcast series, Stories from the Top and Tanaka in 3, check out our website, www.lancetanakagroup.com. They're also on LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple, Spreaker, and Google. Remember, to discover passion, live your dream. Have a great day.